like that piece of music. It's got a Middle Eastern kind of feel to it. All right, enough of me grooving out. Hello, and welcome everybody to Ancestral Eyes, episode 16. We have a guest that we've never met before, and our guest tonight is Dr. Gianmichael Salvato, and I'd like to welcome him to our show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to welcome my co-host, Jean-Jerome. Hello. I feel like I haven't talked to you in ages, a whole 24 hours.
It's been a busy week. Blessings to everybody. Welcome, Dr. Salvato, to our show. It is an honor to have you with us, and looking very much forward for your presentation and our discussion. And welcome and good evening to all those tuning in for episode 16 already. It's amazing.
Wow.
Already at 16.
I know, sweet 16. So, Jean-Jerome, I just wanted to ask you, what was that piece of music that you just played? I really liked that. It had a real sultry feel to it.
Well, in thanks to Utu, Witch Doctor, for his kindness in allowing us to use his music from the Dragon Ritual Drummers in our shows. I thought for tonight's show that Serpentine Seduction offers many different variants and interesting connotation we could explore. So I thought it would be a very good way to introduce our guest.
I love it. I think it's great. Thank you, Utu, for your music. And I have a cat in my lap here, so let me just try to make Kitty fly. Get lost! There we go. All right. Kitty can fly, but Kitty's coming back. Anyway, hopefully I can kick her under the table and nobody knows. Not hard, but kitty kick, right? Get lost, cat. Anyway. So here we are. It's Friday yet again, and I want to begin our show by reading the introduction to our guest. So tonight we have Dr. Gianmichael Salvato. He's a holistic mystic. I like that. Dr. Gianmichael Salvato is an author, an anthropologist, an alchemist, an intersectional feminist, herbalist, and a retired naturopathic physician who identifies himself as a witch. I love male witches. There's so few of them. Maybe, I don't know. Okay, and not only as a witch, but as a root worker in the Italian hereditary folk-magick tradition, Stregoneria. I want to know all about it. I'm not too familiar with it, so I'm looking forward to this episode. I really am. Also, our guest is a co-creator of the world's first social network. Okay, we're going to have to talk about that. And an author of 10 books and more than 5,000 published articles. He is the host of Masca the Mystic and a new series entitled The Holistic Mystic. All right, so where do we begin with this? Well, first of all, I want to know, and for the benefit of a lot of people who are tuning in that are not too familiar with Strega or Stregoneria, could you sort of give us a little bit of a definition of what that is, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. And just because I know that you, like us, broadcast on YouTube and Facebook, just so because some folks who've listened to my videos and we start to see more and more native Italians watching the videos, they feel compelled, as I probably would myself, when they hear me say on those videos Stregoneria instead of Stregoneria, that they want to know either am I Hispanic and I'm pronouncing it the Hispanic way, or do I just not know how to speak Italian? And I'm just going to say that if you're on YouTube and you have captioning on, you will see the difference because YouTube's artificial intelligence translates the Italian word for witchcraft, stregoneria, as Stregoneria. And so it just made sense to me that rather than having that issue, that we say Stregoneria, because that's how all of my friends and family that are Puerto Riqueño and everything would pronounce it anyway. So Stregoneria or Stregoneria is essentially a construct that's applied over Italian magical practice, because those of us that are Italian, for whom this was our native practice, our family practice, we never really called it by any name. It was called our way, or it was called Falu Santucci, do a little holy thing. But we don't, it wasn't until the sort of the modern era when we, like so many other practitioners in the British craft and tradcraft and Alexandrian magic, reclaimed the word witch. So you would, if you would hear somebody, when I was growing up, if somebody were called a strega, it was a pejorative term, even among our practitioners. Oh, that one, she's a strega. But as we reached into like the 70s and 80s, and by virtue and hard work of so many British and American practitioners who reclaimed that word,
yes,
the Italians are starting to catch on as well. So Stregoneria really refers to just the magical practice itself, and then in every region and within those regions, in every family, there are subtle differences that exist that actually make up our particular craft.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a perfect way to describe it, because I was going to say the last 5 or 6 years is when I really began hearing that term, and there were books that have been recently written about that. And I like the fact that, yes, again, we are claiming that name, and there's nothing wrong with that name. It's interesting because recently I had come into contact with someone who said that a little small town near where I live said they might have a problem with me calling myself a witch. And I said, well, I don't have a problem with myself being called a witch. I said, if someone has a problem, that's their problem, not mine. That's not going to in any sort of way, shape or form, influence what we do as a negative way. Okay, we've got to move past that, and I appreciate the fact that you have taken that word, that name, and made it your own, and especially in our own cultures. Absolutely, I think it's quite important to do that. So now, with regards to Stregoneria, whoops, sorry, cat in the way. Would you say that this is something you yourself was raised with in your home?
Yes, yeah. So I would say a couple things. One,
yes,
in that the books that were written in recent years have unfortunately have not been about Stregoneria at all. They've been about an American innovation. And I want to be clear when I say that it's an American innovation, it simply happens to have been created in the 70s and 80s. There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't make that invalid by any stretch, because sometimes people hear something that I'm not saying. That was created by a guy by the name of Raven Gramasi, whose claims of initiation or non-initiation have changed over the years variously. But that was essentially Stregoneria. Stregoneria is what all of those other books are made about, and that's essentially Wicca with Italian herbs and seasonings. It's an expression of Wicca that was adapted to Italian American, not Italian, ways of life and thinking and so forth. And it's beautiful. Stregoneria is a religion. Stregoneria is not a religion at all. So within Italy, to answer your question now, as I was raised with two distinctions. One was the practice of the old religion that only some of the family engaged in. The old religion being the Vecchia religion, or Vecchia religione, which is an aspect of devotion to Diana and Dionysus. in their various forms and under various names. And then there was the craft, and the craft was not religious. It had no connection to the gods and goddesses. It was all about what we might say was divided into two components: the male component, where the uncles and the cousins, male cousins, taught the boys, and then the female component, which was the grandmothers and aunts and cousins teaching the girls. The males learned Hermeticism, what we would call in English in America a Hermetic tradition, the mystery school tradition, mainly Egyptian influenced. The women would teach the herbology and would teach the what can be called segnatori, the gestures, sigil work in English. And because I was recognized early on as a non-binary child, gender non-binary, orientation non-binary, the superstition or mythology within the family was that those kids that are non-binary get taught both. I don't know whether it was because they superstitiously didn't want to miss out on teaching the right one, or whether they really did embrace that there was something unique about that expression. And so I learned from the uncles and the aunts, and I learned from the grandmothers, and I didn't have a grandfather growing up, but by the great uncles and so forth. And so I grew up, like I said, we didn't call the craft the craft. It was just something that you were initiated into when you were 6 years old, at the Christmas Eve. That happened to be the night that it was done. That tradition comes from a particular region in Italy where they believed that was how you could figure out who was a witch and who wasn't, because they believed the witches were always born on a full moon, always on Christmas Eve. So there's some of that ancient mythology that gets tied in there. And so I grew up knowing that it was just our way, and that when somebody had the headaches, or they had what we would perceive as the maloikyo, we would do the diagnosis, and we would do the removal. If somebody needed to manifest something in their lives, we did the Hermetic approach of creating that thing in thought, manipulating the energies around that thing. And so growing up, that just seemed natural to me. I don't know how old I was before I realized not everybody did that.
Right. Now, when you said it was particular to one part of the country in Italy, where was that? Was it?
I believe that the tradition of the superstition that witches were always just born on a full moon and always on Christmas Eve, I think that comes from the Lombardy region. It's not part of the Sicilian tradition or the Southern Italian tradition. So in the Afro-Siculo tradition, which was our family's tradition, it was a combination of African and Basque and Celtic cultures that made up our tradition, and we just believed that everybody was magical, and that it's just a matter of cultivating that magic.
Nice. I like that. So you basically grew up with that. Now, again, everybody knows that Italy is very Catholic as well. So was there a lot of adaptation of Catholic ritual? Was going to church okay? Basically, I get the impression with Stregoneria that it is a folk tradition that encompassed Catholicism. Am I right in believing that?
According to the people that practice Stregoneria, that's how they use the word Stregoneria or Stregoneria, is as folk Catholicism. However, and so from our family's perspective, no, that wasn't really how we see it. However, within the context of our family, not everybody, like I said, practiced the old religion, so I grew up in a family, which was half Sicilian and Southern Italian. And the other half were Hungarian, Romani, Slavic practitioners. And so they all, on both sides, all practiced Catholicism. And then
Right.
because of the little sect within our family that did not include, by the way, my parents, who practiced the old religion. The old religion was always practiced much in the same way that in the Afro-Caribbean traditions, Santeria arose, where we had to hide our practices beneath the veneer of Catholicism because of colonialism. Colonialism particularly struck Sicily as well, and the southern kingdom of Sicily. And so the family would always say, in each generation, one kid would go to seminary and become a Catholic priest and protect them. So I was that kid. I went to seminary. I entered the Franciscans when I was 16 for a very particular reason, a very particular personal connection to Francis of Assisi and what he represented for me and for our people. And I think you may understand that connection as well. And then I went on to become, several years later, to be consecrated as a bishop over the Franciscan community, what they call the bishop protector. And during that entire time, I felt, perhaps because I was young and perhaps because I was naive, that we were mature enough as a society for me to let people know that they did not need the church. The church needed them, and that we could be out and open and come out of the broom closet. And that began the process of about a 4-year process of my slowly retiring and walking away from the institution because I couldn't serve in that capacity anymore.
Right. No, I can totally relate. I can totally relate in that sense. I mean, coming from a Slavic background as well, our form of Catholicism, I always thought everybody sort of practiced the way we did. I mean, when I grew up, we had our little idiosyncrasies. These were our old pagan ways, right? And, and then when I met other Catholics, and Catholics, from an English background or whatever, right? I was always amazed that they didn't do what we did. And it was like, well, what do you do then? So it seemed a little odd to me, when I went to work and I had met some Italian ladies that I had worked with, and they started to tell me some of their folk traditions, right? And I said, yeah, we kind of do that, but we do this, and whatever. And then, it sort of occurred to me that Italy isn't as Roman Catholic as I always thought they were, okay? Which was nice to see, okay? It really was, because I mean, I know, to me, it was very restricting in one sense, the church, right? So I can totally see why you had walked away, right? Now, going back to what you had said, so given the fact that the families, all right, sort of gave up their firstborn or their male child to the church, those that subsequently were in the family, was it up to the men to take the male children and teach them? Was that an expected thing? And what was it that they taught them? Is it something that you can talk about? And then tell me what the females were taught too, just to give us a bit of a background. I hope I'm not breaking any rules or anything.
No. If it weren't for my being gender non-binary and orientation non-binary, I would have been, and it's not necessarily when we think of family, it's not the immediate family, it's the extended, like what I call the Italian family. That might be cousins and uncles and aunts. So not everybody in every family, every individual family doesn't have a practitioner. In Southern Italy and in the Afro-Sichulo tradition, it was generally supposed to be one per generation, where you pick the person who was going to become the teacher and the practitioner for that family. That was almost kind of a calling, and there's an initiation that takes place on Christmas Eve, and as I said, it may be that the uncles and the grandfather, if the grandfather's still with them, talk to and begin at the age of 6 by teaching kind of kids like story telling to the young child that gradually evolves and changes and shifts and includes a little bit of practice and a little bit of exercise. And from the male's perspective, from the female perspective, it starts with a ritual that we call the maloikyo, which is the removal of the evil eye. And so the little girls would learn that. Now, in other parts of Italy, particularly in the central part of Italy, it's grandmother to grandson on Christmas Eve, and they teach the grandson that tradition. So my suspicion is that, as you know, somebody whose doctorate's in anthropology, is that a lot of these traditions evolved out of and came from some of the same places, and that as they came from some of the same places, they merged or melded with some of the cultures that were around them. And so while we try to show respect to all of the different cultures and all the different areas, we also have to like scratch our heads and wink, wink, nod, nod, and say, you know, maybe it didn't really matter whether, you know, maybe it's just somebody was more comfortable. Maybe somebody's grandfather or uncle was more comfortable teaching Hermeticism to the boys because they didn't want the boys in the kitchen. You know, maybe grandma, the boys would be too clumsy. So in our tradition overall, the women would learn how to use the herbs. They would learn about the plants that they cultivated in their gardens and the medicinal uses, and the high altar in an Italian house is the kitchen table. So we don't necessarily have an altar. We may have like little mini altars on a shelf, but the altar is the kitchen table. So the little girl had to learn how to consecrate that space, how to create that sacred space, and how where we could see, we're more familiar with like British tradcraft and the Alexandrian tradition, some of the things we see depicted on TV that have their roots in those traditions. The Italian tradition and Celtic traditions are very, very similar in that the house was all the sacred space. The hearth was the center of the sacred space. And so so where you might cast a circle in some traditions in Europe, the Italians would do it with, you know, a spoon in their hand or a flick of the wrist. And it was just the acknowledgement that we're just moving the energy, but we can move the energy and cast a circle like that, or you can cast a circle with ritual tools. So that was kind of what we experienced. That was kind of the and I was naturally drawn to the kitchen. You know, I was the typical, you know, little gay boy, you know, who wanted to cook and wanted to clean and wanted to read the books, and when I wanted to do it all. I wanted to do the stuff, humble stuff with my male cousins, and I wanted to do the cooking and cultivating the herbs, and I wanted to be the one that was out there talking to the spirits of the plants and the, you know, and the fauna, the land.
Of course, who wouldn't? I mean, that's so much more
I think everything really does. And that's why we just started. This is the first time this course that I'm teaching, a 26-week course, is to the chagrin of some of my family members and some other Italians around the world. We decided, I spent the last 2 years trying to distill the 21 different Italian magical traditions, folk magic traditions, folk Catholicism, into a 26-week course that I could teach male and female, because I think we're in a moment in time and in space where the greatest healing that we can give to the world is to recognize that, you know, what I grew up believing was Italian, was, you know, Siciliano only, is actually Afro-Siculu, and that tradition actually was informed by the Celtics, and it was informed by you. When you grow up in Philadelphia, where there's neighborhoods, the Italians and the Irish were at one another's throat half of the time. And neither one of us would have a magical tradition if it wasn't for the other one.
Right, right. No, absolutely. It's the melding of all of these traditions, really, that sort of
Fill
formulate
in the gaps.
who we are now. And I think it's a natural progression. It truly is. So given that you've grown up this way and like you said, you've done a course, um, do you is there something that you do on a daily basis for yourself to keep you in touch with your spirits? I'm assuming when you talk about your spirits, you're talking not just about your ancestors, but your own personal guides. Is that correct?
Yeah, in my path, and in our tradition, we work with we believe a couple things. One, we believe that there is this energy that science has now quantified, or not quantified, but labeled as 0 point energy, that we called thought, and that all matter materializes from thought, and that all that the witch does is manipulate energy around people, places, and things. And to the extent that the practitioner works in harmony with all other spiritual energies, if you want to call it, but for us, we just call them spirits. With all of those other spirits, including the ancestors and including the oldest of the ancestors, what we call the old ones, that some people call gods, other people call orishas, other people call whatever they call them.
Right,
To the
right.
extent that we work in communion and cultivate relationship with them,
Hmm.
our own ability is increased. To the extent that we're out of balance or out of harmony with those other
Hmm.
spirits, then our energies face challenges. And so part of my
Right,
daily practice is to start with gratitude to the old ones, and
nice.
who have literally saved my life on numerous occasions, and then to be mindful of the fact that I share this space with with the house spirits, with the genius loci, with the
Yes.
spirits of the land, and
Yeah.
then to be grateful because I live in a city. I live in the capital city of Pennsylvania, and so it's a bit of a concrete jungle. But I can go 3 blocks down the street and be at the riverfront. But I have the kind of relationship where, because I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I don't necessarily know all of the plants of this locality because I really grew
Right.
up more in the South than I did up here. So when I say, okay, spirit of Datura, I need you right now. What
Hmm.
can I what plant can you bring to me to do this working? It doesn't
Right.
surprise me when in the middle of the sidewalk, by the street, we came home one day and Datura was growing. Um,
Wow.
that's not
Yeah.
that isn't
Yeah.
Gianmichael's magic. That's the magic. That's the grace and generosity of the spirit of the plants that say, okay, we got
Absolutely.
this. We got your back.
Absolutely. To me, it sounds not just folk magic and root work, but when we say that word root worker and root work, it's kind of overplayed in the sense that we forget the basis of that, which is actually working with the plant itself and the spirit of the plant. And I think that that's important to acknowledge, right? Um, when you do your own practice and you give thanks and in gratitude to all the spirits and that, is there one in particular that you work with? Like, for example, could it be a saint that you're working with? Is there something that you yourself can attune to in order to continue doing your practice? Or do you just, as you said, ask for the plant spirit of Tutura to come forward, and is that how you do your working, or do you have one in particular?
Um, yes and no. Like that's a tough one to answer because I could give really great pop culture answers to that depending on an audience it would resonate with them, because if you don't, I have my camera intentionally blurred so that my altar isn't really clear at the back. Um, if you saw some of the images that are on the altar, you might think that, there's Saint Francis there, and then there's a much more African looking representation on that particular altar. That to a Catholic, that might mean that I had a devotion to Saint Francis, who I think was an amazing inspiration in my life and an influence in my life. But for me, I'm just comfortable saying that doesn't represent, that Saint Francis doesn't always necessarily represent Saint Francis. For me, it actually represents a deeper personal relationship, and so for me, while I'm very respectful of the fact that some of these syncretic practices arose out of having to respond to colonialism and enslavement and abuse and oppression. I do also feel that there's a gift that future generations have gotten from that, and that I get to keep my relationships private and personal. And so the most intimate of my relationships. To answer the question, yes, there are spirits or entities or gods or orishas or whatever label might apply, that I have a very close personal relationship with. But I can't really say that there is one or two. There are one or two that I have been told in numerous traditions, this entity, this spirit is all over you, has your back, courses through your blood, you belong to them. And I certainly think that they're correct in that. But it's like trying to say which one of your family members or which one of your grandparents do you love the most. I literally can't do it. I because I work with so many. I think if I did like I was probably supposed to and focused on one and really cultivated that relationship, I might have an easier answer. But I work with
no problem
wherever I feel called to work. I know that sounds like I was evading the question, and I was, but it's just.
I think you've answered that question perfectly, without revealing too much. And again, I think that is a personal thing. I just wanted to, not so much know who it is as much as that you do, and others. I mean, I myself, I do too as well, and I don't have a problem with it at all. And it doesn't take away from what I do or what I practice.
I break a little bit of the rules. I don't always make the offering that is prescribed, but by cultivating that relationship, there is one in particular in a male aspect and one in a female aspect that I have coffee with every morning. That's the easiest way I can answer that question.
I love it. An espresso, no doubt.
Yes.
Okay, Jean-Jerome, you look like you're waiting to ask something.
No, a couple of things, but that's actually Gianmichael brings up a very interesting point, which is, again, breaking certain set structures or norms, traditions, and all that, and adapting the relationship being really intimate between the individual and the divinities or the spirits that manifest. There is really, although many, practitioners may try to impose a set structure, at the end of the day, what really the ashe, the real energy, is that chemistry between your Joto, your guardian ancestral spirit, and the energies and the divinities, whether, as they say, the Orisha, whatever tradition they come from, or whatever land they come from, if we want to use that metaphor, that description. But that's really where the magic begins. Because I've seen many cases where, people will follow a particular script, or as Dr. Gianmichael says as well, there's the popular response that, typical people like to hear, or they're used to getting the standard response, but it's not the truth. No. It's a facade and an essentially fabricated image
Yeah.
and that really doesn't represent the truth of the relationship and the magic, if you will, that occurs
Yeah.
between that relationship between that individual, which is fulfilling a mission on earth in this human body, and the divine entities as well as ancestors that surround them to help them accomplish that mission, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think, and I think without insulting any one tradition or the way they practice, you're right, Jean Jerome. It's almost like this framework has to fall in place in order for someone to feel something or to do something. And it never really sat right with me. That's why I had to do what I did and break away and do what I do. Right now, so that brings me to what I wanted to ask you, Gianmichael, is what is it that you do? You've written so many books. Okay, so can you just give me sort of a broad scope of the type of books you have written before we get into what type of practice that you focus on? Is it
Sure.
reading like a medium, or do you actually do, like when you say a root worker, do you actually come up with herbal concoctions for people? That type of thing, but just sort of give me a quick rundown of the type of books. I
Sure.
think that might answer my
So, yeah.
question.
So the books that I wrote kind of followed the journey, kind of followed my quest to find expression for something that's really important to me. And one of the things that just kind of like clicked that could have been an easier answer to give you for the last point was, I think one of the reasons I'm just actually realizing this in my head in real time. So thank you for this. One of the reasons I'm so protective about saying who the relationships are with is because I grew up with grandparents who said very, very strongly that cultural appropriation is wrong, that you have to have respect for people who were more oppressed, that when our people first came to this country, because my father is dark skinned and his ancestors were darker skinned, and before that was darker skinned, that we have to understand that where they came from and the sacrifices they made. So I want to be respectful and not seem like when I say I don't make the same prescribed offerings that might be, prescribed for a particular entity, that I'm not taking somebody else's culture and saying, oh
Right.
yeah, well I have a relationship to this person, but I don't make the traditional offerings. I don't feel like it's respectful for me to do that. But I also
Right.
don't want to lie and pretend like I make the traditional offerings that I don't.
Yes.
So the first
Right.
books that I wrote looked at the Christian and or sort of the Catholic and Buddhist philosophies, or the Catholic religion and the Buddhist philosophy. And I attempted early on in my monastic career to help people to understand that I believe that Rabbi Yeshua, that Rabbi Jesus, in those missing years, studied with the Egyptian therapeutae, which were Tibetan Buddhist monks, and so that his entire corpus of teaching wasn't religious at all. It was
No.
philosophical, and so it was much more in harmony with Buddhist teaching than it would have been with Judaism or with what became Catholicism. So those first couple books were about that. Then I started to weave in a little bit of the magical teachings and a little bit of Stregoneria and a little bit of alchemy and hermeticism. And then as the books continued to evolve, I started to deal more with what we might call in the present day, more new thought type topics, kind of detaching it from all of the other cultural inculcations and just really dealing with the science. And then this last book, after reading some of Gramsci's work and frankly being really frustrated by the representation, was my saying, okay, look, there's a difference between Italian magical practice, Italian root work, Italian folk magic, and the old religion. They're two separate and distinctive things. There is zero overlap. I mean, when you go to a Catholic church, as I say, if you go into a Catholic church for the first time, you've never seen a Catholic, you don't even know what Catholicism is. If the first
Right.
person you meet is a priest, you might have
Right.
the inclination to think everybody that is there is a priest. Or if
Right.
the first person intimacy is a nun. So when Charles Leland went to the Boschetto, because we know that Italians don't talk about our tradition to Americans, to non Italians.
Right.
If he did meet an Italian practitioner, she wasn't going to tell him the truth, but she might say, "Come to the Boschetto, come to the Grove, and you'll see a religious ceremony, a liturgy, to honor Diana and Dianos." So he may have gone there and thought, "Oh, so this is a gathering of witches." And there were probably some witches there, but there were probably some bakers there. There were probably some shopkeepers and teachers and shoemakers and everything else. So that last book was about, hey, there are two totally different things. There's some intersectionality that occurs like they do in everything in our lives. But my practice, as it is today, and has been probably for about 40 of the 50 years, 51 years now that I've been practicing, is really that, I would say, probably what you would term in English as shamanic root work. So I do some of the medicine healing. I do some, and the medicine healing is always, it's so interwoven. I don't create a potion or a tincture or an herbal remedy without doing divination work. That's just part of our practice. So there's divination that goes into that part of the work. I may do readings for people, although I don't do those very often by themselves. I'm certainly not a like a commercial witch. Like not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with that, but I don't have a shop. I don't do readings for psychic fairs and things like that. But I do readings when they're related to a working that has to be done. Or when I need to consult with what's the best remedy for this solution. And then the biggest portion of what I do as a strega, as whatever is, and that's why we call the show Masca and the Mystic, is the joke between me and my co-host is that we want people to figure out which one's the Masca, which is one of the terms for witches, and which one's the mystic, because the answer is both. Is kind of the role of the mystic. Like I think that we have, we live in a society that's fractured by binary thinking, or dualism, as it's called, as sometimes taught. So there's magic over here, and there's science over here, and there's always going to be that tension between the two, even though I think they're a spectrum, until we put the third piece, the missing piece, I think, is mysticism. And so a big portion of what I do is try to teach the seeker to unlock the DNA that has the key to their mysticism, because it's not my mysticism. My mysticism doesn't matter to you. It doesn't matter to somebody else. It's whatever that mystical knowledge is that's within you, and it's in your DNA. It's in your blood, and that unlocks the magic, and it also unlocks the wisdom.
Okay. Now,
I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, so when you say that, so if someone was to come to you, obviously because you're a naturopath, right? So you actually use your practice, and I can see how you became a naturopath given your background, right? So if someone was to come to you, for example, and let's say they say something ails them, you obviously can whip that up by your knowledge as a naturopath. And do you do that strictly from, oh, I know this because I'm a naturopath, or do you always go back to your divination and say, let me divine and see? And do you do it right then and there, or do you tell them, call me back in about 5 hours or so, and I will give you a prescription, so to speak? Right?
That's an awesome question. It was one of the things that marked a difference in my naturopathic practice. And even when I deal with people today, even though I'm retired now and don't practice clinically, I have to say that legally. When somebody came to me, their appointment might have been at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but my preparation for their appointment always began 30 minutes sooner. So there was always a spiritual level to the preparation, because we didn't have, when somebody's got a chronic or serious illness, we don't always have the luxury of time. And so it's all the more important for me to cultivate those relationships. So I draw on the wisdom of knowing what plants do what. And in that moment, while they're telling me what's going on, I'm listening with one ear, and with the other ear, I'm listening to, 1 foot in another place, and listening to divine wisdom saying that this is what this person needs. This isn't what this person needs. And then my practice itself would be to tell that person, okay, I'm going to recommend a certain physiological thing for you. That's going to help us to alleviate symptoms. It's going to help us to restore balance. But that balance isn't going to remain if we don't work with the root cause, and the root cause is always in the mind. And so it was treatment. It was really holistic treatment, operating under the legal banner of naturopathic practice.
Right. Okay. So now, because you've retired, in what way do you serve your community now? Do you have recurring clients that come to you, or are you more on the sense of, from what you've said, your workshops that you're going to be offering, more on the teaching aspect to unlock that mysticism, as you said, within themselves? So how is it that you serve your community?
Yeah, well, I actually only started the naturopathic practice because the AIDS pandemic was killing my community, my tribe. At that time, largely gay and lesbian people, mostly gay men. And otherwise, my life would have probably looked a little bit different, because by nature, I'm a teacher. By nature, I'm a hands-on kind of healer, but holistic. It wouldn't have gone into the really academic, clinical side of things. And I recognized that I railed against institutional religion from the get-go. So, excuse me, I know that would have really quickly resolved itself too. And so now, that one of the things, I guess, that's a bonus that comes with being of a certain age. I retired because of physical challenges that presented themselves, but I see those as kind of being the way that the body just manifests the perfect experience for me, so that I could have this freedom to be able to work more unfiltered as a teacher, kind of being where I'm a teacher, I'm an activist, in whatever we need in that moment. Right now, the moment has been extremely focused on social justice work rather than physical body healing. And I see that as probably being where I'm going to be focused for the next chunk of time, because that's where it's about alleviating suffering. And right now, there's much more suffering going on that level than there is even with COVID-19.
Right. Absolutely. And given, the whole atmosphere that's happening south of us, and I mean, to a large extent here too in Canada, it brings not only the disease itself, but a disease of a social nature that comes forth into our community. So, kudos to you for, addressing that and working with that. Right. So I think that is very important, and it has to stay current within our society. So what type of people come to you? Is it let's say, anybody within the pagan community, the witch community can come to you and you can, help them in a spiritual way? Would you say that is more what you're gearing towards, and that's how you're working?
I would certainly be open to that. I'm not the most popular person in the pagan community, because there is a notion in United States paganism, at least. There are two notions that I kind of have issue with, and they have issue with me. One is that you must be there. There's this movement among young white privileged pagan males. That you have to be initiated into a sect, a religious sect that worships the goddess. Otherwise, you have no right to call what you're doing witchcraft or call yourself a witch. I stand opposed vehemently to that nonsense.
Okay.
And then because I don't identify as pagan, they have issue with that. So there are a lot of pagans who come to me, and they come to me and say, "You can't ever let anybody know that I'm coming to you." And then there are people who come to me who say, the traditional pagan path isn't resonating with me. I want to
Right.
be able to respond to what's calling me, who's calling me.
Right.
And then the third group of people I work with are Italians who are saying there's just something from my ancestors that are calling me, and I need to understand. What I think is truly happening in every one of those three cases is I truly believe that our ancestors, individual and collective, are calling for us to do the healing work, because for me, a lot of my work is healing the ancestors. It's paying the price.
I shake. That's right.
Amen and ashe. It's funny. Our whole show was
Very well said.
based on
Very
that
well
premises.
said.
I know when I had come to Jean Jerome, I had a dream, and from that dream, this show was basically created because we collectively thought about that, and you hit it right on the nail, like the nail on the head. That's exactly what I saw. It's not so much about the framework of traditional paganism or witchcraft or whatever. It is us healing. We need our ancestors. We need our guides. We need our angels. We need each other, each religion. Enough of the divisiveness of all religions. Okay, like I am so sick and tired of it. Like seriously, I am. But at the same time, we need to work together. Yes, embrace your individual path, whatever religious practice that may be. But that's the whole point, is bring that with you, not as a
and heal those that are waiting for us to do the work. When somebody tells me just recently, well, because you don't teach a path that teaches goddess worship, which doesn't mean that there isn't a devotion to the divine feminine in my life. There certainly and absolutely is. But it's not when I'm teaching witchcraft. I'm teaching witchcraft. I'm teaching root work. I'm teaching the ancient path. They said, so then you're not a witch and you're not practicing witchcraft. Well, my response to them was simply to say, then show up at my front door and allow me to clip a couple locks of hair and take some fingernail clippings. If what I'm doing isn't witchcraft, you shouldn't have a problem with that. And you know that they won't.
Right. Absolutely. Like, good for you. Well, kudos to you once again.
I really don't. I do not care what you want to call me or my path, because I'm not going to ever sit at the popular kids table. I'm not. I don't write books to become bestsellers. I'm grateful that my books pay my bills, but they're not written for the purpose of paying my bills. So sometimes they're not popular, but healing work, as far as I can tell, throughout all of history, has always been messy. It's never been comfortable. At least it hasn't for me.
Good for you. No, and I think that's the true work that needs to be done. It's not a little package that you put and here you go and have a nice day. No. Yeah, I like that.
And I think it's, again, that's very true. I mean, this is not, if you're really doing the work that your ancestor, your ancestral spiritual guide and your ancestors are calling you to do. It's not a popularity contest.
No.
I mean, when somebody goes for divination, like to myself, or even many in our community, blah blah blah. Sometimes, we're not there to give you the answer you want to hear. We're there to tell you what Ifa, or depending on the divinity or the spirit that is speaking, what you need to hear, and what is meant to be heard. That's not a popularity contest, as you say. Unfortunately, and Teresa has commented in many posts that unfortunately there is a general movement or a general culture, so almost pop culture, where the term paganism became almost like a like a popularity, stylish, I want to be pagan. I want to be a little
Yes.
bit of a rebel, and I'm going to make it look pretty, and I'm going to, and it's all about the appearance and this and that,
Yeah.
without any substance, right?
Yeah.
Because really, when
Yeah.
spirit speaks, it's not always pretty,
No.
right?
No, it's
And if
not.
anybody who really practices and really hears spirit or works with spirit, whether it be through a geomancy, a taromancy, or any type of divination system, whether it be through spirit, through possession, through clairvoyance, clairaudience, whatever. If you're really doing the work, sometimes again, it's not for the faint of heart. That's why I say to many people, don't go for a reading for entertainment purposes. Right?
Right.
That's something, that term really gets my goat type of thing.
I know, and yet
that because of the society trying to mask or hide and to suppress the real belief systems and the ancestral belief systems, they're afraid of the truth. So what's the best way to devalue or take away the merit of what's being said is treat it as entertainment value.
Right.
And unfortunately, we have to work under those circumstances in our society, because our society is not willing to accept that, and so be it. For our legal purposes, we have to, unfortunately. But no, it's true what you say, Jean Jerome. And the other thing too is it's not pretty, and it's not all about just pretty candles and crystals and things like that, which I have nothing against that. Oh God, no. I love all that stuff too, right? But when it really comes down to it.
But in many cases, my biggest problem, and let's be blunt, the only person that would have a problem with what Dr. Salvato Gianmichael has said, and because he hit, I think it's very important for it to be said, is a person which is more, again, enamored with the props, with the fairy tale, with the appearances, than really doing the work, right? And one of the reasons why we did this, where we put this show and produced this show, was to send out a message and to provide a respectful platform for people who really do the work, for the people that really understand the ancestral mission or the ancestral call, to have a platform to essentially cut through the noise. I'll be polite about it. To cut through the noise, right? And actually say, look, people, this is not, again, a joke. When you're doing, you're in many cases, whether you be guiding somebody's destiny, I mean, in case of Ifa, whether you be trying to attend to, as you said, Dr. Salvato, something very well like somebody's health or life and so forth, looking for the right medicine, the right scenario to look at their situation, whether it be a divination through spirit, like what Teresa does. At the end of the day, you don't have the luxury, of being cute. You don't have the luxury of being popular. You're dealing with people's lives, and that's what people. And as you said, if you think what I do is, not the real. I liked your statement. Give me your nail clippings, and a little bit of a lock of your hair. Well, we'll see. We'll put that to the test.
Right. I said that to somebody who recently posted, oh, real witches don't do hexes, real witches don't do baneful work, and frankly, at the end of the day, well, then that means I'm not a real witch. You should have no problems then,
Absolutely.
saying, okay, you're not a real witch. Here's my hair. Here's my clothing. Here's my nail clippings. Because real witches do whatever they have to do to serve the people that they serve. And we start by serving the ancestors. If you don't, then that, to me, that's when I'm not somebody who's going to gatekeep. I'm not going to tell somebody you're not a real witch. It's not my job. It's not my interest. It's not my inclination. But if you're not serving the ancestors first, and the further back you go with the ancestors, you find out we have common ancestors, and we only have one set of ancestors, ultimately. That's why I agree to do shows like this, because it's my opportunity. It's a rare opportunity for me to serve the oldest of my ancestors in doing so. And I don't have to know what it is that I'm healing when I do that healing work. I just have to know that gratitude compels me that I have this life right now, which included being raped at gunpoint and beaten, to within an inch of my life in 1983, which included, heart disease and 3 major heart surgeries and all of this. All of that is nothing compared to what my ancestors have done for me, have given for me. So I don't have to know how I heal them. I just have to know that with every fiber of my being now, I have to want to heal anything that needs to be healed then, so that future generations don't have to work nearly as hard to heal what I leave behind.
Right. Ashe.
And I'm going to touch on three points there, because this is the second time you've mentioned that. In our belief systems, we oftentimes, even in the Faurisa community and Regla de Ocha and even Vodun Fa, etc., there is always an emphasis on the basically working with ancestral spirit guides and ancestors and different spirits and divinity, whether it be Orisha, whether it be Vodun, whether it be Loa, etc. That where the healing work is aimed or targeted in some cases at the individual in terms of his living form. But you've touched on it twice, and I would just wanted to highlight or underscore it, because it might get past some of our listeners, that part of the real work in spiritual or is to do work that heals ancestral wounds, ancestral pain, ancestral debts. When we talk about karmic debts, some of the work goes from the support of the spirit world to the earthly realm, or what we call the marketplace. But part of that work also reverberates and is meant to elevate, to heal wounds, because people think, oh, the person passed away, or the ancestors passed away, they forget all. No. No. Anybody who knows the work, you can have very angry spirits, very angry ancestors, and those ancestors, if you don't address that spiritual trauma, right, that ancestral trauma, the spiritual trauma, you don't advance, and you essentially are condemned to repeat many times the same trauma and the same wounds in this incarnation or this existence, right? And I take it that's what you meant. You very subtly, you said it very quickly, but you're one of few practitioners I've heard that actually has made that subtle, distinction. That your mission, as I've heard you say, is not just to focus on the here and now, or the individual, the human, the living person, but also to look at healing any ancestral pain or trauma that may be in part causing the human being's problems, or the live person's problems, or the descendants' problems. But you have to work it both ways, right?
Yeah, because we even look at it from a medical perspective, a scientific perspective. We have something in science and in medicine that we call epigenetics, and that is the imprint that previous generations have on our DNA, and that particular diseases manifesting themselves, in particular conditions manifesting themselves, that even can affect a person's longevity. And so if as above, so below, if we see on the physical plane epigenetics is a real thing, then it must mean there is a spiritual correlation to epigenetics. And that means whatever I'm experiencing right now has a direct result on the imprinting that my ancestors left in my genetics, left in my spiritual DNA.
Absolutely. I look at that trauma, first generation of World War II survivors, and I know that trauma lives within me, as it does all of us that, come from immigrant parents that had to go through that war. And it's up to us to heal, not just us, but them too. You know, we have their living DNA within us. We have to heal them. And it does. And I think that that's important as well, because that's why the ancestors are here now. Like in that dream that I had, they came forward because they know they can help us, but by helping us, we're helping them as well. This is a new world that we're birthing, you know. COVID, everybody, you know, say what you want to say. This is given an opportunity as a reset, and I will continue saying that this is what it's all about. It's not about the comfort of going back, to our old selves. No, we're not. We're not our old selves. We can't. And
Yeah,
that's
that
how I
old
look
self
at it.
doesn't exist anymore. That old paradigm doesn't
I
exist
just
anymore.
absolutely. I want to touch on two things, Michael. One is a little bit of history, or from your anthropology side, because I think it's very important. People
Yes.
look at let's say an Italian culture, especially in the Kingdom of Sicily, as being monochromatic. Like, oh, they're Etruscan, they're Italian, or they're white, and so forth. But before we actually went live on the show, we had started an interesting sort of segue, anthropological historical segue. Can you tell us a little bit, the audience, a little bit about really what were the different cultures that either settled or passed through, or that really made up both the genetic, spiritual, cultural makeup
Yeah.
of Sicily? Because I'm sure many people, I say, they have a very narrow lens,
Mm-hmm.
of that.
Yeah, when I was growing up, my family would say, "Well, we're Napolitan. We're from Naples," and there was an expression in Napolitan Italian that said that a Siciliano, a person from Sicily, was an African who learned how to swim. And for most people, that was pejorative, and for me, that was like an aha moment. And I realized, because I you do the work, you work with the ancestors, it's very clear that my ancestors did not look like me. And so I started down this journey in anthropology for a very specific reason. I noticed when I was a kid, a teenager, that there were parts of our culture, as you studied Italian history and you learned that the southern part of Italy was the southern kingdom of Sicily. And then I started to think, well, where does, these expressions seem to have a resonance of truth. I know they were meant to be mean-spirited, but they seem to have truth. My dad is darker skinned. And when I was a teenager, about 16 years old, I noticed that I'd hear the stories from the old ones, the old, uncles and aunts and grandparents and stuff like that, that when they came to this country, they were treated the exact same way that the enslaved were treated a couple generations before them. And I would see pictures, and the photographs were all dark-skinned people who indeed didn't look very different from any of the enslaved Americans in the South, people who came here from Africa in the South, who were enslaved. And so the light bulb that went on in my head was that in the most tragic of senses, in the period of 2 generations, from my grandparents to me, and going across the entire spectrum in America of Italian Americans, what kind of magic had to be harnessed out of horrible pain for Italians, Sicilians, to lighten their skin, to destroy the melanin in their bodies in order to avoid enslavement. And that to me was excuse my French, but that was a pretty fucked up situation to have to use magic for. When we could be using magic for healing, we could be using magic in such tremendous ways. Right. Instead, my ancestors did whatever they did. Now, and I understand some of the genetics, they married, they intermarried with Hungarians and lighter skinned people, and yeah, that's fine. But in 2 generations, that doesn't match science, because the African gene is so much more dominant and so much stronger. It's the origins of humanity, for goodness sake.
Right.
I should have been at least almost as dark as my dad, and I'm not. You know, my mom's gene should not have been that dominant, but I believe there was oppressed magic that took place that said we do what we can do to survive, and that just rips at my heart. It saddened me as a 16-year-old. Like most 16-year-olds get angry over stupid shit, the boy or the girl that doesn't like them. What did it to me? And then I saw my youngest sister and my youngest brother also clearly have that feeling where we felt. I feel, I won't speak for them, I feel like my culture was taken away from me because I wouldn't know. Like I can't tell you why listening to Celia Cruz or listening to old Connie Francis and Frank Sinatra resonated the same exact way for me. And the reason was because it was the primal beat. It was that primal feeling that was deprived of me. I grew up in a household where we were told you're not allowed to speak Italian. You know, I learned how to speak Italian because the older ones spoke it at the table so that the little kids wouldn't understand them. And I wasn't being left out of the conversation. And so when you think about that, I'm sure that in other cultures around the world, to answer Jean Jerome's question, the people of Sicily were a melting pot. So Sicilian accent or language, what we call Siciliano, people assume is an Italian dialect. It is the furthest from Italian. It's not a Romance dialect or a Romance language. I have a natural affinity for languages. It's the hardest language that I've ever studied, and I'm still not even remotely proficient. It's closest linked to Arabic in terms of its actual makeup. Then there's Basque and Celtic or Gaelic as the second highest influences. A little bit of Spanish. And finally, the smallest percentage of Siciliano comes from Italy, comes from Italian. So as goes the language, so goes the culture. And when you go to Sicily, you find this architecture and design that's absolutely stunning, that brings together components that you see in Ireland and Scotland. I personally feel like the closest thing to what happened to the Sicilians in Europe also happened to the Scots. I believe Scottish people were actually closer linked to Hungarian Romani people, and as a means of stopping the oppression by the British colonialists, they became what we see more of today. So there's that magical connection that hides beneath them, just like there's the African connection that hides beneath every Sicilian and courses in our blood.
Very, very
No, absolutely.
And in terms of, and I'm sorry to focus so much on the Sicilian as a locality or geography, but because you mentioned Basque influence as well and other, in terms, I mean, underneath the Catholic sort of envelope or the appearance at a in terms of a spiritual and sort of ancestral divinities, do you find any evidence or do you find any remnants of, for instance, because there is an entire pantheon of Basque gods, and it's very quite elaborate and as well. And also, since you mentioned the Arabic, do you have any evidence, or is there any leftover in terms of things like the belief in spirits like jinn?
Yeah, there are, and in fact, some of actually the Sicilian words relate. The reason that they relate more clearly to Arabic is because some of those philosophies are still there. Where the sort of, if you jump into the mainland of Italy, you have that dichotomy of there's angels and there's demons, where in the the Arabic approach, we understand the jinn can both be fearsome, and you're not working with a spiritual energy to necessarily, you're not working to eliminate an evil spirit. You work with the wrathful spirit to eliminate a condition. So in the Sicilian pantheon, we see a lot of evidence of that. Stella Maris, for example, you can see evidence of both Yamaya, and you can see evidence of Chaxi Roxy. I probably just completely slaughtered her name, but that's celebrated in the Canary Islands. And that's again those layers. I find from an anthropological perspective, if we look deeply enough at the Basque pantheon, we actually see an evolution and influences from both Egyptian and West African cultures that evolved over time and picked up other influences from minor influences from around them. And so we have to kind of reverse engineer and go from Sicily back into those cultures that created the island of Sicily, see who conquered who at what point in time, and the conquering entity always would have a greater influence on that time period, and then that eventually where people think, oh, the Roman pantheon was something that Romans created, and all of these alabaster-skinned gods and goddesses actually evolved out of Etruria, and the Etrurian pantheon was all dark-skinned, all nappy-headed, all much more closely related, and then the places where you think you wouldn't find it in France, we find some mysteries that help us to understand that the whole story of the Blessed Virgin Mary was much more heavily influenced by the story of Isis. And then if we go a little further back, we find that the story of Isis, that story also evolved and goes deeper back into more ancient stories. And so when the further I suspect that the further we distance ourselves from religion as an institutional right and go deeper into a spiritual relationship, then that's where the merging takes place, and where the difference between the story and the life and the real personality of Francesco d'Assisi becomes no different as a representative of somebody who embodied wisdom and compassion. So in the Catholic tradition, you got St. Francis, and there's that San Damiano crucifix shooting laser beams into his hand that were supposedly the wounds of Christ and supposedly stigmata, where in reality, Francis had such an embodiment of wisdom, the actual essence of wisdom, knowledge, and compassion come together, that in other cultures might be known as oromiya. And Francis developed those wounds because he was the one who said there are people with leprosy who are dying, and they're not dying because they have leprosy. They have leprosy because they're not feeding themselves, because their hands might have their fingers might have fallen off. And so he went out there and he took care of the lepers. He fed the lepers. There's paintings that were made of it. So those wounds didn't come from a little magic laser beams that came out of a crucifix. Those wounds came from compassion. And so for me, the line distinction between Francis and who Francis might represent in my life became really quickly blurred. And it became one essence, one inspiration. Maybe Francis didn't draw his inspiration from the exact same Orisha that I see the connection there. But who's to say that it's not that same truth, that it's that same wisdom that says, what, Francis might get a little bit freaked out if he sees this representation of me. I'll appear to him and it works for him.
Absolutely. It's that personal relationship that we form and forge in working And Saint Francis of Assisi may be very different to you as opposed to me, and certain aspects will overlap and be the same. But it is, again, it's that personal relationship, and that's what this is really all about. And it's forming that connection to the other side on the spiritual realm that we're able to make effect here in this world. So, Jean Jerome, did you have any other questions or anything?
We're just getting warmed up.
Yes, so, we are.
Again, in terms of your anthropological, but also your spiritual work, what credence? This has been a debate or discussion we've had with other guests, and also outside of the show, within my thought practice and so forth, between different spiritual belief systems. For instance, from Nkisi to Vodou to Orisha, Isidimbele Orisa, to the thought practice and so forth. What is your understanding, or your, especially in light of what we've just talked about, spiritual archetypes, the idea of a spiritual archetype, and how does that, first of all, do you ascribe to that as aspect of the really a spiritual archetype? In the case, like we use St. Francis of Assisi being a spiritual archetype that is syncretized or basically equated to Orunmila. What in practice, in theory, and in your sort of revelation through your spiritual journey, because you've been through many different belief systems, and also you come from an area which has a wealth of different traditions that have flown through and intermingle, interact. What is your concept of that term, spiritual archetype, and how does that resonate with you?
I think that's an awesome question. I think that's an area that will serve humanity in the greatest in this coming time, is understanding that again, that this dichotomy doesn't have to exist, that we don't have to choose between working with an archetype or working with a god or an orisha or a spirit, that both things can be possible at once. And so I believe that for the whole of humanity, it goes back to the belief that the birthplace of civilization, for me, that the birthplace of civilization is in Africa. And so they are the oldest of our ancestors. And so it's very possible for an archetype, which all of humanity shares and might express itself in various ways in different cultures, a great way to move us out of our part of the world into another part of the world that we may be less comfortable with, so that we can look at it more objectively, is in Tibet, the archetype of compassion is Chenrezig. In India, it's Avalokiteshvara, and both of those are male. But if we go just a little further east, we have Kuan Yin, and Kuan Yin is that archetype, is the identical syncretized essence of Avalokiteshvara, but Kuan Yin is female, and so ultimately we all have these needs for the archetypes that represent the same spiritual qualities that we have. One might see the spiritual, the expressions of the one. And we all have this sense that there is, whether we're religious or scientific, you can call it the one or source or God or goddess or whatever you want to call it, or you can call it 0-point energy or dark matter. But from this vast, unquantifiable, unknowable reservoir of essence, energy, all things manifest. And so that means that among the all things that manifest are all the qualities, the quality of the mother, who gives life to everything that arises from the sea and then moved onto the land, the quality of wisdom and knowledge, the quality of the fearsome defender, the fire who brings the fire. And so in every tradition, there are those archetypes, and I think the challenge is in both recognizing the universality so that we stop drawing those effing lines in the sand, that I'm right or wrong, we're both striving for the same thing, and it says my responsibility is me. I got to do me, and so I
Yeah.
need to find my ways of connecting to those archetypes. For some
Yeah.
people, it just seems more natural for me that those archetypes have physical relationships, personal relationships, I should have said. And so for me, they are with actual entities. For others, maybe that it's possible to connect with those archetypes in a strictly Jungian sense, where you say, okay, I know this is just a representation, it's just a metaphor, it's a part of me.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us, that there is no difference between that. Yes, I do believe the archetypes represent a part of who I am as a person.
Yeah. Yes.
But who I am as a person can't be extracted from who the
Right.
Orishas are, who the gods are, who the saints are. We're
Absolutely.
all expressions of the one. And so ultimately, I tell people, with tongue in cheek, that's why if you go into a group of gay spiritual seekers, gay male spiritual seekers, there will be 50 out of a group of 100 guys who swear to you that they were Cleopatra in their last life. It's not that they were. It's that's their aspirational goal is to connect to that essence, and so our
Absolutely.
challenge as we go forward is to aspire a little bit higher. No shade to Cleopatra, but let's
No.
aspire to something a little bit greater than that.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
that's where we do that ancestral healing. That's where we do that deeper connection. And that's where we truly become of service, I think, to all of humankind, and not just to our tribe gets bigger is what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's you hit it right on the nail again. Our tribe is humanity. Okay. Not color, not, whatever. Okay. We are a tribe, and we've got to start treating each other that way, and with respect. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard sometimes, especially with what's going on, politically and socially. But I think we'll get through this. I really do. So.
And we have to do it. I think I just want to say, I think we have to do it while I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, we should be colorblind and the world is my tribe, and therefore, I don't have to acknowledge that I live as a racist just by virtue of the color of my skin, no matter how close the genealogical ties might be, no matter what ancestry DNA says. I would love to be able to be colorblind, but until I recognize that that's white privilege speaking, I do respect the fact that I can't know, and I'm grateful that I can't know the pain that those with more melanin experience. It just doesn't mean that they're not my brother and they're not my sister and that they're not my responsibility.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Exactly. Let's not just, pardon the pun, whitewash everything. We have to acknowledge that, a part of our humanity, a part of us is hurting, and we have to acknowledge that. And if that means acknowledging, people with different colored skin, so be it. Right? So,
question. In terms of, we have a question from the audience, but just before I just post that question, you mentioned divination. Going through the different belief systems you've gone through in your own spiritual sensitivity and clairvoyance. What would you say is what is your main system of divination? Because you made it, which I like very much as well. Before you apply treatment, you immediately consult. You do consultation, you do divination to assess the situation. Is it possible to know which is your chosen method of divination?
Yeah, for me, fire and water scrying are my first go-to. If I don't have an opportunity to do either one of those, obsidian scrying would be my go-to. If I have to, and it's a big if I have to, because I'm not ever convinced that I have to do this. I've used things like oracle cards and dream work even. I put dream work in a completely different category for me because it's much less divinatory as it is consultative. That's when I get to pull up the chair and listen. But for the majority of divination for me, it's either number one, fire scrying, number two would be water scrying, and in the absence of having the proper bowl, a dark enough bowl to be able to see clearly, I always have obsidian with me.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so I'm going to pass on to a question from Jay Sword. She's been very active. Thank you very much for your questions and
thank you,
Jay.
And your comments.
Yes, she says, In Aradia, Gospel of the Witches by Charles G. Leland. How authentic would you say was his portrayal of folk ways or folk magic? And in corollary to that, she says, in Italian culture specifically.
That's an amazing and an awesome question. It's actually part of what I talk about in the course I'm teaching and in the book, because I think it's so misunderstood. We have no way of knowing for sure whether Charles Leland, who was a brilliant folklorist, he was from my hometown of Philadelphia, so major props to Philly for producing a brilliant folklorist in general. We don't have a way of knowing whether the Vangelo, the Gospel of the Witches, was really given to him by this woman, Maddalena, or not. Whether it was or wasn't, I would say that there's question about authenticity. If it was given to him by Maddalena, then it only represents, and let's say right up front, it's non-representative whatsoever about Italian witchcraft or about Italian folk magic or about any of the root work or anything else that Italian witches do. It has nothing to do with Stregoneria. It is entirely about the old religion, the cult of Diana, the cult of Lucifer, Morning Star, however you want to look at it. So in that respect, it is only partially authentic in that it only represents one small piece of the literature, of the liturgy that would take place within the Dianic cult. It's the public facing part that anybody could experience. The deeper mysteries, as with any initiatory tradition in their religion, are not represented at all in the Gospel of the Witches. And so I think what happened was Leland gave his interpretation. He imagined that it had to do entirely with witches, which it doesn't. And so nothing that an Italian witch would do, who was not a part of the old religion, is reflected at all in that liturgy that's explained in the gospel, in the so-called Vangelo, and not the full picture of what would take place for a practitioner of that religion is portrayed either. So it's one of those things that, like in one of my books, in Magic at the Crossroads, I include the entire Vangelo at the end because it's open source, it's in the public domain, so that people can see. It really doesn't talk about Italian witchcraft at all. It doesn't talk about. It only tells us the story, the myth, that Diana and her brother became intimate and gave birth to Aradia. And the question I think that it begs at the end is, so what? So they gave birth to Aradia, and Aradia was supposedly a witch, and claims that she was the first of the witches. But then, if she was the first of the witches, why didn't she stick around? And why did she have to come back in, I don't know, I think it was the 1300s or the 1400s when they say she was born again? It just sounds suspiciously like too many other mythos that we've heard before.
Yeah, I find that interesting.
Fingerprints of the Catholic Church all over it too.
Right. It's funny because when I read that book, I thought, okay, so how does this relate to being witches? Are we just assuming that it is, and that's what it's about? It was nothing more than a mythology to me, and another name for, utilizing in the sense of identifying a goddess figure or an aspect of the goddess. But was it really? I mean, I don't know. People put a lot of emphasis on that book. I read it. It didn't do a whole lot for me, put it that way, other than it provided a mythology.
The reason it's had influence in the 20th century is we desperately, as human beings, cling to and hunger for origin stories, and that being the circle of witches, the origin story of witches, is better than what I think the truth probably is, that Gerald Gardner took those stories and took Margaret Murray's interpretation of those stories and perhaps lied when he said that he was initiated into a witchcraft's coven that nobody else ever heard of and might not have ever existed before he created his own magical path. And then because Gardner did it at the same time, one might say, Alex Sanders wasn't able to really provide any real veracity to his claims of being initiated either, and his story sounded remarkably like Gardner's, and that was an easier story to use as an origin story than to say, hey, you know what, I've read a lot of occult teachings, because I think both of them actually drew most of what they learned from the Rosicrucians, from the Golden Dawn, and all of the occult Theosophical Society, Rudolf Steiner, and all of them. Why not just say, you know what, guys, I've read this. This is really inspiring to me. All these occult practices. I think I'd like to create a tradition, a living tradition that may or may not be similar to what the practitioners of old did. Because at the end of the day, who cares what the practitioners of old did? Our responsibility is not to live in the past, it's to live in the present moment. Absolutely. And in the present moment, our tradition has to be living and breathing and dynamic, and has to always seek new expressions. And so let's create, I tell my students now, I'm teaching you a class on that's informed by my practice of Stregoneria over the last 50 years. But my hope is that when we're done, because there is no initiation that I'm going to offer any of the 21 students I have right now, there's no initiation. At the end, I want you to initiate in the mysteries that get revealed to you, and let's create something postmodern. Let's not do a neo-pagan tradition. Gardner and all those guys already did that. And there's nothing wrong with any of those traditions. They're beautiful. They're amazing. They're just they create the tapestry that is magic itself. But let's pick up the ball and run with it in the postmodern world and say, maybe it's time for us to create an expression that responds to this world, this moment, the needs of our culture and society today. And maybe the play or the position that religion plays in that might be a little different than it was in the 1950s. Let's hope it is. Let's hope it's more reflective of who we are as a diverse people.
Right. No, I totally get what you're saying, and I agree. But bringing it back to the perspective of Ifa, Jean-Jerome, we, as practitioners, it's very important to have that ancestry behind us. Am I correct? So, it's marrying the old traditional ways with making it modern, right? How would you sum it up, Jean-Jerome, in that sense?
I think there's it's a delicate balance. Everything about Ifa really is a question of balance, right? Balancing the light or the dark with the light, and trying to find equilibrium so that you can accomplish your destiny or mission. So part of that is you're resting on the lessons, the teachings, the traditions that were passed on, from father to son to daughter over, centuries or millennium, and practicing and being able to honor those traditions and beliefs. But one thing that we always point out is Ifa is not was never meant to be really a dogmatic belief system, in that the Ifa, because of its geomancy and various forms of communication, bi-directional communication with the spirit world, allows there to be, always a constant dialogue, and also the ability to adapt. Right? There are Odus Ifa like Okanaroso that says, to the land that you go, do what you see. Right? There's an aspect of adaptability and dialogue, in a sense, where your ancestors may say, hey, this worked for me in my
Right.
when I walked the earth, but I know this is not going to work for you. You need to go beyond this.
Adapt. Absolutely.
Right? So there is a fine balance between honoring the traditions and having that basis of the mysteries of the history and everything else. But again, we're living in the present, because the past we no longer have, and the future we may or may not have. Right? So we have to make the best we can in the present, and we have to be flexible. The moment we become dogmatic, or we become, to try to be totalitarian in the belief system, we lose the essence of that spiritual connection and that spiritual dialogue that that is the heart of our belief system. And again, in Ifa, every destiny is different. Every person who chooses their destiny in Obedi, they choose a unique destiny. They may it may be classified under one of the 256 Odus of Ifa, but each 256 Odus of Ifa has hundreds of Itan, hundreds of stories and variations that precisely talk about the story and the experiences of their ancestor within that, living the influence of that energy of that Odu, and how they were able to manifest it and to live their life, and then each story adds a different context, a different history, a different medicine, if you will, that basically makes up an ever-growing, really, corpus of Ifa. Right?
I mean, how many of us are abuelas or grandmothers or nanas would ever have imagined, just in their generation, that there would be an expression of the one on their television set, because they couldn't imagine the internet. And yet today you're making that living teaching available around the world in a way that even in our grandparents' time, they could only imagine being like local, because, Ed Sullivan was on TV, and, like they couldn't imagine Ed Sullivan having on, a teacher who would reach around the world, even though saw the Beatles get on his show and reach around the world. So the tradition lives, and one day people will look back and say, oh, how quaint it was back in 2020. They were doing this little show on the internet.
That's right. That's right. Somebody's going to be watching this show on a rerun on Mars or something.
Telepathic.
Oh, goodness. But no, but I mean, like just a simple, talking about the technology. I like the concept about and I listened very carefully on that part, especially because my background, half my time is spent in technology for the last 27 years, and half the time is spent in Ifa. I work both sides, right? Because I'm a director of ICT consulting and secure cloud services. So technology has always been a very, very integral part of my life. So what you mentioned about not having the dichotomy, that separation between magic and technology, magic and science, really resonates with me personally. But I mean, one of the things we talk about dogma or so, like, because of tradition, because of the way Ifa or even the process of divination was done in person, face to face, and so forth. There was a time, like 2-3 years ago, where there was a big debate between traditional practitioners saying, oh, what's this thing about internet consult or consulting by internet and everything else? Not understanding that Ifa and any spirit has no barrier of space and time, right? You can be anywhere. It's just another medium to be able to see the person. But the funny thing is, again, showing adaptability, all of a sudden pandemic hits. And everybody and their grandmother who has an internet connection, who was doing things, no, we can only do it, in person, all that. And I was like, okay, I have a Zoom account, I have a WhatsApp, I have a Facebook. I can do this. Really, I can, because all of a sudden you realize if you don't adapt, you disappear, right? They can't help. They can't provide the medicine. They can't provide the healing, and that's you're basically you confine yourself to a situation which basically is an end game, right? And where you're no longer serving spirit because you're stuck in a habit. You're stuck in an outdated or basically a limiting belief
mindset
yourself, right? A mindset. So very interesting.
Sure.
Now, before we transition to final questions and comments, because we're coming close to the 2 hour mark, we're 50 minutes to the second hour. I cannot end the show without at least having you say something a little bit more, Dr. Salvato, about. You mentioned you're very good. You're one of our guests who often tunes in is Melvin. He says, "I wish I could contribute to the conversation, but this is all new to me. So just wanted to say hello, and I'm enjoying the show. Also, Dr. Gianmichael is very well spoken, and I will concur with that."
Absolutely.
In your very well spoken style and vast knowledge, one thing I cannot let you get off this show without telling me, or at least talking a little bit about, is what you just glanced or glazed over, which is the Dianic and Lucifer Morning Star cults. And I remember hearing in one of your other shows where you touched on it briefly, but that the conceptualism of those two figures, but especially Lucifer Morning Star, was very different in terms of what you described, the reality of that, divinity or that spiritual entity, versus the typical demonized, sort of Roman Catholic association of the term Lucifer, the light bearer, to be, Satan or devil or the antagonist to the Almighty. Is it possible, without betraying anything, can you touch on that a little bit more so people, because I'm sure people heard it and they're like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And because I'm no longer a priest in the Dianic tradition in the old religion, I can do that without breaking oaths or anything like that. I can tell you that first of all, in our tradition, the concept of what some might classify as good and evil, like angels and demons, is no different than what modern practitioners of magic might consider the difference between baneful and healing magic. So there are spiritual entities that work with the wrathful aspect of the divine, and there are spiritual entities that work with the healing aspect of the divine. And so among those is the and that we talked about archetypes a little bit. So there are archetypal representations of the planets and the aspects that the planets have, and the energies that those planets have. So we have Venus, Diana, and then we have the morning star representation in Lucifer or Dianus. Early on in the development of the mythos in the Etrurian legend, it was Uni and Tana. So it was the divine masculine, the divine feminine, who represented the moon, Diana, or Uni, and the morning star, Venus. Somewhere along the lines, and it's not really clear because the mythology doesn't follow the same path all over Italy, somewhere along the lines, Diana suddenly became also representative of Venus. And my suspicion as an anthropologist is that somewhere along the line, a feminist just said, enough, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, they're both one and the same. And so in the story there is some overlap as well. We have representations, and one of the things I thought was kind of cool about the way that names occurred in the Italian traditions and the Etrurian traditions was that they are also similar. We have fauna and faunus, so we have the god and goddess of the fauna. We have Lupercus and Luperca. We have Diana and Dianus, and so this person of Lucifer, of the light bearer, was just that dichotomy between, or that balance, interplay between the moon and the light, and the bearer of the light. So it's a completely different person than the entirely made up character of Satan in the Christian mythos, which is some kind of devil guy, which was based on a misunderstanding of Hashatan, who in the Hebrew tradition was the adversary. So the adversary in the Hebrew tradition was more like the prosecuting attorney. He was never a bad guy. He was, he was the prosecutor who said, okay, isn't it true that you were at such and such a place on such and such a time, and this was your motivation? His role was to serve at the right hand of the one, as the prosecuting attorney, and somehow, just like Pope Gregory the second turns the character in the Christian scripture of Mary Magdalene somehow into a whore, which is
absolutely
not anywhere to be found in the actual scripture itself. The church manipulates stories, and manipulated the story of Hashatan into Satan, and then in order to manipulate and control people, all of a sudden they gave him the characteristics that would be more closely linked with Pan or Lupercus, and suddenly that became Lucifer, where in the original Greek versions of the Bible, Lucifer is mentioned, I think something like 200 and some times, but every one of those mentions is a reference actually to the Christ. So it's not a mention of a devil, it's a mention of their own, resurrected God. And then when we start looking at some of these ancient stories, we see that they did more than a fair amount, I'm being generous, amount of stealing from everybody else's mythos and stories to create the stories that were told in their New Testament, including a fair amount of taking from the Etruscan legends and the Egyptian legends. Otherwise we wouldn't have, I don't know that I could reach it, but, when I thought it was cute that a bunch of the little older ladies in my group that I run on Facebook saw this picture, and they saw the Blessed Virgin Mary, and said, oh, that's really beautiful. That's Mary and Jesus when they went to Egypt, when he was, which if they paid attention to their story, that would have been when he was 11 or 12. But if we move a little bit closer, you notice there's Diana and Dianus, or Isis and Osiris. Where are we? I stink at doing this. There is that's a representation of Isis, not a representation of Mary. So my point for doing that sketch was actually just to show that there is this universality, or this interweaving of sacred myths, and Lucifer is one of those great ones that we that we really miss out on, because as the morning star, he's the bearer of wisdom. There is a greater connection to Saint Francis or to Oromilla in the true story of Lucifer, of the morning star, of Dianus, than there is to this, mystical, mythological Christian devil.
Right. So I just wanted to, just for clarification, so there is Stregoneria, which is the actual practice, right? as opposed to the old religion, which we were just talking about, the mythos. Am I correct in believing that?
Yes, Stregoneria just simply means witchcraft. It's the
root work.
craft, yeah. And then the old religion, which you may or may not have been part of, it wasn't required to practice the craft.
Right.
The old religion is just referred to as the vecchia religione, the old religion. There's because so many different ones. You could be maybe part of a Dionic cult. You might be part of the cult of Demeter. You might be part of the cult of Lupercus or Pan. The Janara, that was another cult. That was Jana and Janus. So it depended on where you were from and who the local gods and goddesses were in that, and the era, like where you were in terms of timeline.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. Yes. I wanted to make sure that was a distinction, because that's how I was listening to what you were saying and describing the old religion in that way. I remember reading something once, and I don't know where I picked it up, where, someone was saying something about Catholicism, and some Catholic priest had made some comment to a woman, like, you better be careful or else, and she's, you know what, you can be replaced like that. Our religion. And when she was saying our religion, she was referring to her old religion has been around a lot longer than, Christianity itself. Right. So, and I remember when I came upon that reading, I thought, you know what, good for you. Exactly.
Well, but it also underscores, just as a sort of as we sort of conclude, it also underscores that a religion or belief system which is practiced by well over 1 billion people all over the world, and has been one of the belief systems most associated with the colonization, the enslavement, and the eradication of entire cultures, and still
brainwashing.
Today, the brainwashing as well.
Absolutely.
Essentially, and then claiming a set of dogmatic rules that were cherry picked from different belief systems and based on political, economic, and social political control objectives. It's interesting how that is the belief system that is oftentimes one of the belief systems that's oftentimes the first in line to criticize, to still today suppress, malign, demon, other indigenous belief systems that carry an immense cultural, spirit, and religious basis, right?
Yep. No,
absolutely.
for sure.
Are we breaking up a little there?
I feel like the screen is freezing. Jean-Jerome.
A little bit, I think, because we're probably getting a lot of activity. Melvin says, to be fair, though, if we're looking at it from a story purpose and converting people through a story, then a bad guy is needed. The Satan that we know of in the Abrahamic belief was created for that very purpose, to be the bad guy so people can look to a hero. Sadly, it's a brilliant form of control, and we lose our thoughts because we have fear of the bad guy.
Good one, Melvin. No, you're right.
And we just need to be a little more clear in that that is not the character from the Abrahamic traditions. That's the character from the Catholic and therefore Christian tradition. That Satan does not exist in the Abrahamic traditions overall. A completely different character exists in the Judaic and the Islamic.
Shaitan.
That's right. And even earlier, the Zoroastrian tradition, the opposing of Ahura Mazda as God and Hanuman as the sort of the juxtaposition of that.
Right.
So absolutely. So we have one other comment. Such a fascinating show. Thank you to you all.
Thanks, Claire, for tuning in.
So
Claire's one of our loyal watchers.
Absolutely, but I'm going to just before I showcase one of our most loyal watchers of this show, because
Oh.
we just got some live feeds of one of our most steadfast watchers of the show, which I'm going to showcase and share my screen. Dr. Salvato, do you have a quote? I mean, after your trajectory and different, spiritual belief system, do you have a quote that more or less summarizes or believe this philosophy?
Yeah, I tried to give some thought to that when we were preparing for the show, and there were two, and I couldn't decide which one I liked better. And they're probably two of the most two quotes from two sources that people would least expect to come out of my mouth. But
Okay.
one of them comes from a book called The Doctrine and Covenants that was written by a guy by the name of Joseph Smith, who is the founder of the Mormons, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in that, one of the bits of wisdom that he says in the very beginning of that book is that happiness is the object and design of our existence. And I've always loved that. It just seems like it was maybe a little bit out of place in the book that it came with, but that like really struck me, and I always try to find wisdom in every book. And then the other source, which again people are going to think is not what you would expect from somebody who spent the last 35 years in academia, really diving into these amazing books of occult wisdom. But it comes from Sir Terry Pratchett, who some of you might recognize as being the author of the book behind Practical Magic. And in an unrelated book, he says wisdom comes from experience, and experience is often a result of a lack of wisdom. And I actually have that on a bulletin board in my other office, because that just sort of reminds me to keep it humble and to keep it real, and that the only way that we're going to ever evolve as people is to recognize that our wisdom comes from our experience. So it's not what's in the books, it's not what's in the oral tradition. It's what the oral tradition inspires in us. And it'll never inspire us if we don't recognize that at the end of the day, it's not about what we know, it's about what we don't know. And that just gives me the energy to get my ass out of bed in the morning and say,
and the motivation.
Let's find out today what I don't know.
Ashe.
Good
Well
one.
said.
Thank
well
you.
said.
Thank you so much. Well, it's been a very good show. I've quite enjoyed this, and I'm so glad. I feel like I've made a friend. So thank you, Gian. Can I call you Gianmichael? How do you like to be called? Gianmichael? Gianmichael. Okay. And here, since his birth, this godson of Jean Jerome's loves to tune into our show. Okay. And here he is once again. Little Mojo. He's hilarious. Look at him.
I won't look at
What's he doing now?
He's watching the show. He was trying to get a different angle. And
that's awesome. Thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. I hope it's been
and now his sister is joining in the fun.
Okay, of course, little Titi. Hello, Titi. Anyway, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for joining us.
Having me on, I say.
Yes, no. And I want to thank everybody.
Very, very good.
Yes, and I wanted to thank everybody who tuned in to our episode 16. And I hope everybody's enjoying themselves, and have a good weekend, everyone. Have a safe weekend. Take care to all. And once again, thank you to our esteemed guests. It was very nice meeting you. I so enjoyed the show. Thank you
very much.
And thank you, Jean Jerome.
Thank you, Teresa, as always. And I just want to make a special announcement for next week. Next Friday, we have our first guest from England,
Yes.
Jenny Uzel, who is a druid and a member of the OBOD and Ovate grade BDO at Bardic grade. So she'll be joining us next Friday. So I hope everybody will tune in. Once again, thanks to our guest, Dr. Salvato. And until next time.
Right. Oh, and John Jerome, also, just if anybody needs to contact Dr. Salvato, you can reach him at the bottom. There we go.
Yeah, I've been scrolling. The contact information. That's right.
Right. Yes, and anybody can contact you, Gianmichael, for any workshops that you have upcoming or something like that?
For anything.
Perfect.
And by all means, just call me Gianmichael. That I don't stand on formality or titles or anything else. I just always forget when I'm getting ready to do these to take the doctor part off there.
All right. Thank you so much.
If you have it, you have it.
Yeah.
All right,
Odabo. Okay. Blessings to everybody. Thank you for tuning in.